to welcome you all to another edition of, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you again to another edition of DOSCO Talks. My name is Tarun Soni. I'm delighted to welcome you this evening or morning, wherever you are in the world, or afternoon, perhaps. Very excited that we have three past editors of the Doon School Weekly from the 90s. I don't think this has ever happened before, so very excited to have Deepanshu Bagchee here and Govind Dhar and Pratikaksh Basu. Gentlemen, thank you for taking out the time to be with us today. We're going to be talking about how to build content for the digital age. And I think that's a very exciting and topical subject and one that interests all of us. But I won't get into the questions. Let me just do a quick introduction, of course, of our speakers. Deepanshu Bagchee is the Chief Product Officer of ITV, based in the UK. He is batch of 1996, and I'm sure Govind and Pratik, while they grill Deep, will get into his background and his journey as to how he's gotten to where he is today. Govind Dhar is our present editor of the Rose Bowl, and Govind, batch of 1997, is a editor and journalist. He's worked with a variety of different publications around the world. He's lived around the world. He's written about all sorts of interesting things. Govind, it's a pleasure to have you here. And I must mention to all the attendees that as Govind departs as the present editor of the Rose Bowl, he will continue as a consultant and assist Basu, our latest editor, in his journey over the next year. And that leads me into the introduction of Pratikaksh Basu. Pratik has joined in very early in the morning from California. Pratik, welcome. And congratulations again for taking on the role of the editor of the Rose Bowl. Pratik is batch of 1993 and is an award-winning filmmaker. And again, he's had a tremendously illustrious career and worked with numerous organizations. And I hope you will cover little bits of what you've done in peppering Deep with all the questions on how to build content in this world of ours. So, gentlemen and ladies, if you would like to ask questions, feel free to use the Q&A section. Feel free to use the chat. Pratik and Govind will take those questions. They already have a set of prepared questions, but they will take them during the course of this hour's conversation. Thank you for joining us today. Over to you, Basu and Govind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining, especially Basu from California so early in the morning. I just wanted to quickly do a quick rundown of some of the things that we've done before we put Deep in the hot seat and question him about all the variety of things that he's done in this space. I've been a print editor and freelance journalist for a long time in my career, covering everything from arts and culture to travel. I've done a luxury publication in India called The Rob Report, and then created a publication on arts, culture, and documentary in Sri Lanka. Basu, may I ask you to quickly give us a rundown of your background with Google and what you're doing with film now?
Yeah, really quick. I was a consultant briefly. I chucked it all up to go to film school for some reason. After that, I went into corporate America with Google to pay off my student loans. And after all of that, I'm back into sort of doing film right now. So that's my quick rundown.
Fantastic.
And then I was going to say, pass it over to Deep, whose rundown I think is a little bit more ziggy-zaggy and quite substantial.
Quite ziggy-zaggy, yeah. Listen, I'm normally the person asking the questions, as we all did as chief editors of the weekly. This is going to be a different experience being asked questions. I spent, after leaving school, I really enjoyed journalism. I went and studied economics, and I ended up doing journalism for kind of the first decade of my life. And then a moment of epiphany or luck or whatever happened, and I decided to switch to the business side. And I've spent about the last 10 years almost now working on the business side. So really looking forward to this discussion, and it's really special being on a panel with two other weekly editors. So really special.
Thank you. Basu, do you want to launch with the first question?
Sure. I mean, I guess the first big question is that you were in India, you'd finished your undergraduate, and then you went all the way to Cardiff to study broadcast journalism. So if you can explain what was your thinking when you did that, and what was the experience doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I started out in journalism in Delhi, working for a small production company, doing kind of reporting from foreign places for Doordarshan. My DOSCO connections didn't help me get a higher station or a better job. So that's where I found myself. And along the way, I found reporting really interesting. And for a while, I even worked for Doordarshan. And I saw that really the entire broadcasting industry was changing from what I had seen growing up in Doon School. When I joined Doon School in around 91, 90, it was all about the first Gulf War. And you're going to watch the unfolding of the first Gulf War and CNN. And I remember standing in Jaipur House in the corridor and reading the Times of India and seeing what was going on in Iraq. And back then, all kinds of broadcast media was a cameraman with a big, heavy camera. There was an audio person, there was a producer, there was lights. And then you had this kind of foreign correspondent. And increasingly, by the time the 90s rolled around, and the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a small little van or truck with a satellite dish and someone with a small little camera, single cameraman and a reporter. And so I said, I really need to learn the technical skills. I've come through economics and international relations, but really how to film and edit and shoot and do everything as a small unit is something I really need to learn those technical skills. So when I got a scholarship from the British Council, Chevening Scholarship, to go study at Cardiff University, I really jumped at it. It was a fabulous year because you learned how to film your own cameras and edit and do all these very technical things. And I think it really helped me later on in my life. And I think we've seen that across the entire news industry in India and Delhi, how newsrooms have become so digitized, and it's all now about small cameras and compact teams. So it was a really important thing for me to go and learn.
Cool. Yeah. So you were saying that you saw the switch to it becoming like a much smaller production unit. What were some of your early experiences doing that?
Yeah. So when I came back from Cardiff, again, it was back in the job market in Delhi. And I ended up, Aaj Tak was then starting Headlines Today. It was going to be the English channel. And I actually got an interview at Aaj Tak. And funny story, I ended up in the offices of Aaj Tak one morning with my CV in a folder and all of that, just fresh back from Cardiff University. And I just waited in the waiting room, and I was supposed to meet this executive, I won't take his name, who's supposed to meet me in the morning for an interview. And I waited, and I kept looking at my watch. It was 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. And I thought, has this person forgotten about me? But I had this real grit because after 5 hours, this executive turned up and my interview was like perfunctory. It was like 10 minutes. And I guess he was testing me now. And I think back at it, because so much of journalism is about hanging around and waiting around for the news to break. And this was his way of seeing if someone would actually sit and wait for the news to arrive. You end up sitting in all these government offices in Delhi, waiting for some source to give you some little story. And it was a really good test because I stayed there for 4 to 5 hours and I got this job with Headlines Today. So I did Headlines Today for a while, and Headlines Today was this really interesting newsroom that had been built on CNN technology. Everything was digital. The entire teleprompter was digital. Everything was computerized. A really wonderful new studio they had built, but it was a very small channel. And then CNBC TV18 came knocking, and I ended up on the business news side working for CNBC. So back then, all reporters being poached. There were all these channels fighting it out for television rating points. So I ended up switching to CNBC, which was a business news channel. And then about 6 months later, CNBC TV18 is this really entrepreneurial place launched by Raghav Bahl of Network 18 and Haresh Chawla, two really entrepreneurial leaders in the media industry. And they decided to open a bureau for CNBC in the US because increasingly Indian companies were going to New York. They were listing on the New York Stock Exchange. They were listing on the NASDAQ. And they really needed someone to tell the Indian story from the US. And so they looked around the newsroom and they tried to say, who here could do all these things? Who could shoot a camera and edit and film and do the whole thing themselves? And I had just come back from Cardiff, so I knew how to do all these things. So I was lucky. I got that ticket. I got that plane ticket out of India to get on an Air India flight and go to the US and set up that bureau. And what's really interesting is that on the side, they also wanted to launch a channel for South Asian. So they launched this channel, which failed eventually, but it was an interesting one-year experience where they launched this channel called South Asia World, which was trying to reach out to the diaspora and become a channel for Indians in the US. So I was lucky that experience in Cardiff of learning to shoot camera and edit and all got me onto that plane ticket for that next opportunity.
Awesome. And then I guess going from that, you said you had the epiphany to sort of go from there to the business side of things. What prompted that switch, and how do you think it worked out?
Yeah, so New York was obviously a blast, just living in a place like New York on a very small journalist salary. So you weren't wealthy, you were living in New York, and it was a kind of 5-floor walk up on the Upper East Side, rat infested, and living on an Indian journalist salary in New York was interesting. I got to cover lots of really interesting things. It was really a seminal moment because, for example, a lot of Indian companies were just then doing big things internationally. It was that time where the Tatas were buying a lot of things. So you had Indian hotels buy the Pierre Hotel in New York, and I was able to interview Ratan Tata when he came there. Infosys launched its secondary issue, so they sold stock in New York, and so you were able to I was able to interview Nandan Nilekani, and then it was Manmohan Singh's visit to the White House, which was a big moment. So really taking my one camera and shooting in the East Room of the White House, and then packing all the gear up and walking across the White House lawn and doing phoner interviews and kind of on the phone. So you got all these amazing experiences. But my experience in that 1 year was that this little fledgling South Asia World that we tried to launch failed because we didn't have the distribution in the US market, because increasingly distribution in the US is mainly around cable. And we had decided to ride on these dish TV, on these kind of satellite dishes that weren't in everybody's homes. There's a much more niche market for the dish TV business. So that channel failed. And I was so enjoying just the business side of things that I got this opportunity to work for Bloomberg in New York, Bloomberg TV. And I said, this will be a great way for me to learn the business side, because Bloomberg is where all the financial journalists are, all the CEOs get interviewed, you really follow the markets. And I wanted to understand the business side of things. So I went from being this on-air, on-camera reporter and anchor to being this behind-the-scenes producer. And my first job for Bloomberg was calling people up to take the 6 a.m. interview slot. So I kind of went down a couple of rungs, higher salary because it was an American company. But I was just basically calling people to come onto the 6 a.m. shows. And there I worked my way up. I started working as a TV producer. And Bloomberg is this fascinating place where you have all these conference rooms. They have this concept of transparency. So every conference room is just glass. It's completely transparent. You can see who's in there. You can see, what's up on screen and all of that. And even Mike Bloomberg sits on a seat outside his glass cubicle. He doesn't actually sit in his office, and everything's very transparent. So it was a really great culture. It was like a mini MBA. You had lunch and learn sessions where you would learn things. And so I learned a lot about the business side. And over time, I started shopping around these kind of business ideas. So I would take a 2-page memo to the president of Bloomberg and suggest that we should launch something new or launch a new business. And over time, I found that actually the people who were working a lot of that were external consultants, so Booz Allen and those kinds of consultants. So I said, wow, I really need to learn how to build a business plan and a business case and do the analysis and so on and so forth. So I decided then to leave Bloomberg, leave a green card process and leave all of that behind and go and pursue an MBA, because I thought I really needed an MBA to make the switch to the business side, where I was getting more and more interested in the business side. So I left Bloomberg at the end of 2008 and went to study an MBA at INSEAD in France. And who would have thought that just as I left, the global financial crisis had started and the markets were in meltdown. So I landed up in this MBA to try to switch to the business side in the middle of the global financial crisis.
My God, what a time to do that. And so then after that, you popped up in a different industry, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I was in my MBA program, everyone was scratching their heads like, who's this journalist who wants to do an MBA and change careers? nobody could understand what, the general concept of media management meant. Like, I want to work on the business side of the media. There was no defined way or job of how to get into media management. There's very set career tracks of investment banking and private equity and venture capital and consulting and so on and so forth. But what do you do in a kind of a general management role in the media? So I applied to lots of jobs, got lots and lots of rejections. And it so happened that I ended up working for a professor at INSEAD who had a startup, and I started to work on a new product, which was social media analytics, and it was the internet space and so on and so forth. But startups don't pay the bills. You have kids, you have a life. So I ended up actually moving to Singapore to work for CNBC because they had a job, and it was kind of like going back to the newsroom. But then from there, things started happening really quickly. They could see that I knew digital. I became the digital editor. I moved to London and started heading up digital. And really, the thing that ended up really, I think, becoming my next path and the path that I've enjoyed the most is product management. Product management is really this amazing new functional area within companies. You have finance and marketing and all these different teams, business development, and product is really how to create the product, how to launch a product, how to market a product, how to price a product. And it sits in the middle of all these different functions. And really, in a media company, it sits between content, technology, and the business side, and really product sits in the center of that, which was really so perfect for me. So I ended up as VP of product for CNBC in New York, in New Jersey, and then worked my way up, ended up eventually doing technology. And then after doing that for about, working for CNBC for almost 10 years, I got an opportunity to work for The Economist in London and to move back to London and head up The Economist as Chief Product Officer. So that's kind of been my journey over the last 1.5 to 2 years.
And I guess you have a next big move coming up. And it's funny, we just got a question from one of the attendees about that. And the question is, your next move is you're joining ITV as Chief Product Officer. And I think that's a newly created position just for you, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's the first time the ITV's had a Chief Product Officer.
So their question is that since ITV is an online platform, what's it like managing the products with a journalistic background rather than a tech background?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when I first entered product, I would say I came at it much more from just the content space, my knowledge of the content, my knowledge of the journalism content. And so much of what you build with the technology in media companies, you're really building a user experience and a delivery mechanism around the content. So understanding the content is a big piece of your work. But I've been working in this space now for over 7 years, and over time you really start to understand the technologies. You get much more technical. At CNBC, after I'd done the role for about 1.5 years as VP of product, our CTO left, so our Chief Technology Officer left. And I did that role temporarily as a Chief Technology Officer. And eventually that led to a permanent role as Chief Technology Officer and Chief Product Officer joined together in one role, which was SVP of Product and Technology. So over the course of the first several months was a baptism of fire. I learned a tremendous amount. You see things go wrong, you see outages in technology, your site goes down, you have performance issues, and you basically, it's really creative problem solving. It's understanding the technology, it's getting into a room, it's whiteboarding stuff with your engineers. And I have to say that over the years, I've really appreciated technology and really, really fallen in love with technology. And that's the interesting thing about product. A product role has to be technical enough to know the art of the possible. You obviously have your deep technical people who advise you and tell you how to build something or the technologies that are available, but you do need to be technical enough, because essentially as a Chief Product Officer, you are the interface between the business side and the technology capabilities. And so you sit in the center of that. So you do have to be able to translate and speak both those languages.
Just to jump in here with talking about the digital side and the technological side of the product, coming back to your work at The Economist, I mean, we've seen the growth of how digital technologies have moved into, everything has moved on to the mobile platform now. So when you went from news media to something like The Economist, which is slightly more traditional print publication, what were the challenges of the business models there? And how do you take someone like The Economist, who've basically been a print publication worldwide into the digital space? How do you build that product?
Yeah, I think a lot of this journey started even before me. So I'm the first chief product officer at The Economist, but over time, I think as all companies have had to, even The Economist has evolved from being largely a print publication to being much more digital. So, there's a lot of digital subscribers now, and people subscribe digitally to The Economist much more than you would think. And increasingly, even the print subscribers, we have provided them digital access. So we have cross-entitled them to digital. So they're almost like bundle subscribers, right? They get the print copy, but they also have access to the podcast and all the digital aspects of the content that we produce. What's really interesting, and one of the reasons why I was so excited to come to Economist, was it's a big subscription product. It's more than 1 million subscribers. And increasingly, I think the big thing that the internet has done is kind of the disintermediation of the typical delivery channels, or the typical moat that people built around having distribution. You can now go over the top to your customers, and that's what's happening in every business, from shopping and e-commerce to print publications to television, which is, I'm sure we'll talk about that. And so this ability to reach directly to your customers means you need to have a great website, a great ability to purchase on that website, a great experience once you've purchased a subscription to any service, and then get the value proposition out of that, be able to consume the content on the go, on your smartphone, in different apps. And so I think it's really been about, all this time that I spent in product has been about that. How do you reach your customers directly? And obviously there's different models, right? You have direct to customer as a subscription, but you also have trying to aggregate lots of eyeballs online and then sell advertising against it. And those are your two primary business models. Increasingly, there's newer business models, that are smaller, but there's around e-commerce. So driving a transaction. So getting someone to read a review about some type of new speakers or headphones, and then actually go to Amazon and purchase it. And then Amazon pays you a transaction fee on that. So e-commerce is also growing in the content space. And then, a much smaller one is syndication, where you kind of syndicate and license your content out to other people. But whether it's television or print content, all of this kind of disintermediation is happening, and you have all these new business models to try to make money.
So how do you keep up with that? I mean, considering the way advertising, the last time Basu and all of us were talking, we were talking about double click and how that the advertising game has changed. We saw that affect print in a really, really big way, where in print journalism, we started losing a lot of advertising revenue because people said we'd rather spend that and we get far better bang for our buck going online. Can you give us some of the background on how the advertising changed the game for you, and whether those volumes are large enough now for, to have critical mass between digital and print?
Yeah. I think in the old days, you would buy advertising in, let's say, print, you'd buy the back cover, or you'd buy a single page, and that single page had so much value because, you'd sell it at such a high price, often a fixed price. Basu's experience is really apt here, because as you explained, you work for Google, and Google just, I think, understood early on the advertising game, right? I'd love to hear from you, because they just understood and started buying all these different parts of the ecosystem and aggregating it all into one great advertising offering.
Yeah, one of the, I don't know if I signed an NDA or not, but like Google first came to the fore because of search, and then everyone was focused on search advertising. But when I was there, the sort of things we didn't talk about at that time as much was the sort of content side of it, where they could blast out the text-based ads onto all these thousands and thousands of publishers, all these different websites. And that gained a lot of traction. And then that eventually became media ads, rich media ads, and then with DoubleClick that just further enhanced their capabilities. And then they bought YouTube for, I think it was like $1.6 billion, which might be like the greatest acquisition of all time, because at this point in time, I think YouTube makes something like $25 billion in revenue a year, maybe something around those sides. And it's only growing. That's only like the sort of the very beginning of it. And it gets tricky because at this point, people are trying, and then, with the Maps products, with Google Earth and Docs and stuff. So they have their own little ecosystem, much in the way that people think like Apple has their sort of hardware software ecosystem. Google has a sort of user ecosystem where you're wedded to Google products at all times. It's a little tricky because people are beginning to use the M word, the monopoly word. But then you had Facebook, who's, I think, at this point, the big competitor to Google, which you must have seen when you were doing your print stuff back then, having to compete against the sort of duopoly, as they call it.
Yeah, I think that's been the biggest change in the industry is the rising power of Facebook and Google, which made, I think, a lot of the print publications realize that living off advertising was not going to be sustainable, that Google and Facebook were eating their lunch. And so over time, for a while, I guess the print publications, as they moved online to digital, their argument was, we are top of the funnel advertising. We're about your brand. You associate your brand with the New York Times. We are not performance advertising as Google and Facebook are. But I think, the entire kind of, online news industry has found it hard to compete against the power of Facebook and Google. And increasingly, I think more and more, since the NYT paywall really went up in 2011, you've seen a whole movement of publications moving to a paywall and moving to the subscription model because they feel like they can reach a broader audience paying a higher price, and that can get them a better revenue. And, you've seen that Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, The Economist, so many of the top kind of journalism publications have moved to a paid model.
And it's funny, that's the next question that someone just asked, is that, do you think there's a future for paid content aggregation, like a Netflix for magazines? I think Apple News is trying to do that.
Yeah.
And Google had a product because they're saying that there are many publications behind online paywalls and it's hard for consumers to commit to one or two publications.
Yeah, I think everyone's trying to build a Spotify of the news. Is such an interesting, exciting idea. But I think, the first chapter of the internet of content on the internet was a lot of the producers of content gave it away for free. It's available everywhere, Google search and all. And now I think, obviously the media companies of the world have learned that they shouldn't fall for that again. So I think people are being very careful about offering their content for someone else to rebundle and own the end customer experience and own the end customer paying relationship. And more the people who are big enough are trying to go at it themselves and have a direct to customer relationship themselves. So I think the challenge for anyone trying to build a Netflix or a Spotify in the news business is trying to sign up some of the biggest players. And obviously Apple News has done it with Apple News Plus. But it's a challenge to get all the top publishers to agree and be part of that bundle because they know they'll get a smaller piece of the pie. And then once again, they'll have a distributor in between them and the end customer, and that's not something that they would really like.
That brings us nicely on to, did you have a question, Basu?
No, I think we were going to ask the same question, which is, the big S word in America right now is streaming. So yeah, I was just going to ask, I think Govind is probably going to ask the same question, which is that the challenges and opportunities facing the broadcasting industry from your point of view, now that, with ITV and stuff.
Yeah, so I think the world of kind of newsrooms and publishing and what used to be print publishers becoming digital and going subscription first, the television industry for a long time was protected from that because they had a really good business model. In many cases in the US where your distribution via cable, you were being paid by your cable, MSOs or MVPDs were paying you a fee for each of their subscribers. And then you had advertising on top of that. So you had dual revenue streams and quite a strong moat because of the cable distribution that you had. And it's interesting to see even that industry has had to adapt, right? So they've also had to go direct to customer because over time, initially, all the media companies thought we can just sell our content to Netflix and make a nice fee on the side. It's the same content. We have a windowing strategy. So it appears, first on screen, on big screen, then on our channel, and then eventually we can sell it on to Netflix. And so at first there was this relationship kind of like, a symbiotic relationship. But over time, again, they realized that Netflix was aggregating huge audiences and was increasingly owning that last relationship with the customer, the final relationship with the customer. So it's been such a rapid change in the industry from when people saw all the eyeballs were moving to Netflix. Cable households were declining in the US, so people were actually cutting the cord and cutting their cable subscriptions. And every big media company had to figure out their direct to customer strategy. So they had to go over the top and try to establish a relationship with the customer. And it's a really a massive amount of investment has gone into streaming, into aggregating all that content, buying all that content. You see people like Disney buying Fox, these are huge size deals to get that level of content to be able to compete with the Netflix and to compete with Netflix's spend, annual spend on producing content. So the streaming place is really a fascinating place right now. Everyone's trying to build their user experience, trying to buy their content and go over the top to customers. So the same thing that the print industry went through is now definitely squarely happening with the TV industry. It's just that the TV industry has learned their lessons and is trying to make sure that they move quickly towards a direct to customer relationship while still having that older business model where they're still being paid via linear. So they have that time because they have that great amount of cash coming from their linear operations and their traditional broadcast operations, and they can invest it over time in all these streaming platforms.
So that brings us squarely to a question of content differentiation, because Netflix just democratized the way that we have a number of these, especially internationally. The number of markets just opened up for the sort of content that we saw. And now it just seems to be a bit of a land grab for as much content as we can get. So that obviously makes your job quite interesting in terms of how you structure this. So what sorts of opportunities and challenges are you seeing down the line for how you get this content or generate it or build it so that you can compete with the likes of Netflix and Prime?
Yeah, I'll speak apart from ITV because I'm about to join them. I think just broadly, generally in the industry, it's largely around content budgets. So a lot of this is really the firepower that you have to be able to purchase content is a big driver of it. But then I also think like increasingly people want to work with certain studios where there's a creative force and they feel like they're part of some bigger force and they're part of some studio. And the producers of this content also want to see the maximum eyeballs for this content. So there's that drives a lot of the decisions in terms of how you can participate in this ecosystem. So I think a lot of it is about content acquisition, but I also think it's about a great user experience. It's about the e-commerce billing funnel that you need to build. You need to build customer service. So there's lots of different aspects to having a good streaming platform. And then you still, I think, will have, geographic plays, whether it's Hotstar in India, whether it's different geographies where local players will emerge and do well. There's content niches. There's a lot of kind of niche providers of content. And I think the other thing that I think is an interesting space is, so far it's all been focused on subscription VOD, what's called SVOD. So it's an e-commerce play, it's direct to customer and the subscriber pays. But increasingly, if you look at what, we just talked about YouTube and Basu talked about the YouTube acquisition, look at what, Google has built with YouTube, what an ad-supported business that is. So I think there are some subscribers who, after they've paid for Netflix or whatever, don't want to pay for more streaming options and may want to have an ad-supported option and are willing to watch ads. And obviously that ad experience has to be good. So I still think there's a long way to go. There's a big ad opportunity as well with video. And I think that's what's different in some ways to the print opportunity, because if it's just text, you get banner ads, right? You get the ads and people zone out the ads and it's called ad blindness on the internet. But when you're watching a really important piece of video, you're watching a big game or football or cricket or whatever, you are willing to watch those ads, and those ads are meaningful to you because you're waiting for the program to start. And often those ads are obviously video ads. So it's really about sight, sound, and motion, which is really, really important in selling a brand message. So I think in the video space, there's still a lot to be done with ads. And there's a big opportunity around ads that I think is harder in kind of the news business and the traditional kind of text and banner ads business.
So this brings me around to the. Sorry, go on, Basu.
No, I was just saying there was another sort of user question that I was just going to piggyback on that when he said about advertising. They were asking, hi Deep, how do you see the future of branded content?
Yeah. So branded content, so the ability for an advertiser to have close alignment with the publication, sometimes through advertorial content or sponsored content. I think that's was a big part of where media companies went after they saw that their main kind of, at least news companies, when they saw that the banner ad blindness and the fact that people weren't clicking on those banners on those websites when you read an article on a website, that really was about starting to insert sponsored content or branded content on their websites. And I think a lot of websites dialed that up because that was their way of making money. In places where there's a strong kind of church and state division, that's still not possible because they try to keep the newsroom separate. But in other places, and you see it a lot in India, where those lines are not clearly demarcated, you see a lot more advertorial content and branded content being a big driver of the business model. I think, it's in some ways what I think the Facebook newsfeed or the Instagram newsfeed did was they made kind of branded content or advertising almost part of your newsfeed. And so it's almost like you see a card from a friend and then you see a card that looks like an ad with an interesting video and it all kind of looks the same. And I think what's happened is the traditional media publishers have tried to introduce branded content, but it doesn't really fit very well in the kind of design and in the user experience. It kind of juts out, it stands out. But once you get to kind of this news feed experience of Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, branded content or targeted ads that feel almost part of the experience work much better. And so I think in some ways, Facebook and Instagram and those guys have got a much better offering when it comes to branded content or advertising that kind of sits in the middle of the content that you're consuming. So I don't know where it goes from here, but I think that increasingly the best advertising experience within the experience itself is being owned by the platforms.
Cool. I wanted to bring this way back to the plight of the writer. The three of us started out as writers at school. Basu actually gave me my first byline in the weekly with a very embarrassing poem, which we won't go into now. And I used to sit and watch Deep actually write his editorials for the weekly. Coming back to the writer, I'm in touch with a number of SE formers even now who I keep trying to recruit onto the board of the Rose Bowl. When I talk to them about how they're kind of structuring their future, I still hear a lot of writers talking about getting into either novel writing or creative writing or going the route of the kind of hard-nosed news journalist and hoping to get into one of those streams, either by writing for literary journals or for joining the big newspapers. Just with viewing how all of this has changed, and especially with your journey, what would your advice be for the aspiring either weekly or other Doon School magazine board members when they go to study English literature and go from there in terms of the way the world's going now?
Yeah, I think, I've been so far away for a while now, for almost a decade, from the newsroom and the creative side. So please take this with a pinch of salt. I would say, and Basu, please feel free to weigh in because you've also seen this from your point of view. For me personally, I found working in a newsroom gave me a lot of the character and the kind of like the background, the knowledge, the experience, a network, a brand name that opened doors for me later on. So, it's sometimes hard in this industry, in the kind of creative industries, whether it's magazine writing or whatever, to start out from scratch. I always found my lucky breaks came through internships, and internships then led to some experience in a newsroom, some writing, some producing something. For a while, right after I finished Doon, I got this lucky internship in making ad films in Bombay through someone that we knew. And I was part of one of the hangers-on in the production of the first Pepsi commercial in India when Pepsi came back to India. And it was just an experience, like just getting that internship and being on the set and seeing how things work. So I think internships can open doors. But then I found working in some kind of company with a brand and building my network and my name then helped open other doors down the road. It's hard sometimes when you're just starting out. But Basu, you probably have a better sense of this.
Not that much better than yours. For me, it was, like you said, getting sort of tricked into joining the weekly when I was in school, that sort of forcing you to write. And then when I was in undergrad and grad, I did some stuff for the school papers there. And for me, that was like, I guess, the closest I came to being in a quote unquote newsroom. Obviously these weren't like grown journalists, there were other students, but they took their jobs very seriously. They acted like you're in a newsroom. And back then it was actually print. So it had that sort of feel of being, like you see in the movies of people hunched over keyboards and like stuff is happening all the time. So that was really good. And then if there's any sort of thing I've learned that I would pass on is that I don't know if Malcolm Gladwell actually said it or someone thinks he said it, whatever the 1,000-hour rule is. And I think Govind would talk to that. It's just you get good at something by just doing it. You just keep doing it again and again and again. And for me, weirdly enough, part of that was when I was in corporate America, just as a side thing, I used to write a little weekly movie thing for people because people would always ask me, hey, what's a good movie to watch? And that, for some reason, really sort of unlocked my fingers a little bit and really got me going. And that was a big thing. And that was like completely unexpected. And like you said, you have to, in some ways it was an internship because I did it just on the side. So yeah, it's just these sort of unexpected things that get you going and sort of unlock this kind of thing. Let me just jump in with another question for both of you guys, actually, that someone just came in with. For both Govind and you, what has been the single biggest impact on co-editorial content as a result of media digitization? Like the fact that
content, yeah.
I guess they're asking, like, since things moved, the platform moved online, the platform became digital, what do you think the impact was on how content shifted?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably so many different angles to tackle that question too. Obviously, the whole disintermediation and going direct to your customers is the biggest thing that the internet did. But then the rise of the social media platforms was probably the second biggest thing because they became huge drivers of traffic to whatever content you were producing. So if you had someone shared a big link on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, that made your thing hit the zeitgeist and shoot up to, #1 in the rankings where there was page views or whatever. So the power and the control in some ways of all the conversation happening on the social media platforms and then driving traffic to you, which, there's a lot of discussion in the media industry, whether that then led to kind of, extreme polarization, people really, writing content or writing headlines that were clickbaity, that, got you to click, but then didn't actually deliver on the promise because it was just trying to make the next buck from advertising. So, there's this whole kind of new mechanics of the internet got set up. And, some people say that some of those mechanics are obviously not healthy for democracy and so on and so forth, but there's lots of those types of debates. I don't know, Govind, what do you think?
From my perspective, on the ground as a writer, the biggest impact that we got from going digital is that when I was sort of scrabbling to become a features writer, my entire deal in life was to have as much fun as possible going to music festivals and restaurants and traveling the world, and then getting someone to pay me to write about it. So while I was actually trying to find my way, the key thing was to get some editor's email address, to try and get your way into, to get a byline, and then to get into the good books of the editor. So you got lots of commissions from some of the big names around the world. And then the way the digital came in and kind of completely torpedoed that, is that in the features writing space of what they call lifestyle, which was travel and food and things, was that everything was being run by PR companies. And 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, PR companies tend to control all the content that you're seeing in some of the big names like GQ or, Wired magazine. So it's essentially the relationship between editorial and PR has completely blurred, and they seem to call the shots in terms of editorial. And then being part of the generation that has one foot either side of the digital and the kind of print field space, the interesting thing that happened is that we used to get very annoyed when you'd have someone like a Veer Sangri who had, eaten, more fancy hot meals than the three of us put together, was the only guy that people went to for stories because he had the experience. So I was sort of, at the door kind of knocking and saying, I also want a chance. And then right from under me, the carpet got pulled out because suddenly you had the rise of the influencer. So I'd be eating at a Michelin star restaurant in Hong Kong with X number of reviews under my belt and waxing lyrical about the kind of cut of beef that was being served. And this Michelin star chef would tell me that he'd been receiving emails from influencers and these kids who had no idea about the game, who were trying to get in at the door. And a number of them do. So it's while digitalization has kind of democratized the space, and we have a lot, a much higher number of voices telling us what they think about, film or a watch or a beauty product. It kind of leaves, the people like me who are getting into the dinosaur range a little annoyed because we feel a little entitled to the experience that we've had to kind of hard scrabble and put together. That's my 2 cents.
So you need to be on Insta, and rather than writing for GQ, it's all about Insta.
It's all about Insta. I have another question for Deep. If Basu, if you don't have another question.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Cool. So coming back to the editorial that Deep was writing, I think it was in the last Founders Day issue for the weekly. Deep, I don't know if you remember this, but you were writing about how Doon makes you a jack of all trades and a master of none. Do you remember this editorial?
Yeah, I do. Oh my gosh.
Okay.
Yeah.
The reason I remember it so well is because I was literally sitting at your side, and I think they'd moved the weekly room into what is now the library upstairs.
Yep, upstairs, yeah.
And you were very confidently typing out this editorial, and I was like, holy hell, I have to do this next year, so I better think of something smart. And I remember you saying quite vehemently that, jack of all trades gets you nowhere. And it would be much better if you specialized in one space. And I was saying, no, I'd much rather eat from the buffet of life. And you were like, no, Govind, that's not the way forward, man. So considering all the things that you've done through your career, do you still hold the view that you'd rather be a master of one thing rather than jack of all trades?
Thanks, Govind. Thanks for rubbing that in my face so nicely. I do remember that.
Yeah, I've waited a long time. I've been 25 years.
Isn't that the most amazing thing about the Doon School Weekly? You can be a 17, 18-year-old kid, all high and mighty, up on your soapbox, shooting off those editorials, telling the headmaster how to run the school, telling a teacher how to run his house, telling Walia what to do in the dining room. Like it's just so funny. It's such the power of the pen. No, I really truly retract that because my career, as Basu said, has all been about zigzag. And I think Steve Jobs said it really well. When you look forward, you can't connect the dots, but when you look back, you definitely connect the dots and you say, oh, wow, that thing led to that thing that led to that thing. And the weekly is just such an amazing experience. I'm sure both of you feel it. In the final kind of SNSC forms, when I became chief editor of the weekly, and we were in, I think it was Diamond Jubilee year or so, and we had as chief guest, we had Manmohan Singh, who was the finance minister. And I remember me and the editorial board sitting in Shomi Das's veranda, and he gave us this like cassette recorder, his old tape recorder. We put a tape in to record these interviews. We had Manmohan Singh, and then we had Vijay Mallya also show up. And we had these 2 amazing interviews that we could do as the editorial board of the weekly. And Manmohan Singh came in his white kurta pajama, single protection officer and a driver, nothing else, no retinue, no, like really simple man. And I think all of us, and I don't know if we've even told anyone this story, I think we were either too enthralled by this whole thing or too nervous. We forgot to hit record on that cassette player. And we interviewed him, and then we turned back and we played the cassette, and there was nothing there, like we missed. And I don't think any of us had even taken notes. And I remember it was really hard writing up that interview afterwards. And then when we interviewed Vijay Mallya, I remember the only thing I could stare at was his Gucci loafers and his 2 diamond-studded cufflinks. And I just couldn't concentrate on the entire interview. And he kept using this word moot. And I said, moot is such an interesting word to use in this context. But it's just like that experience, prepares you for life, that kind of broad experience of being able to interview a leader or being able to interview a business leader at the age of 17 and 18 and write up an article just prepares you later for kind of what comes in your journalism life. So I'm sure you guys have your own stories. It's such a special thing. And I can see Ashwin Bhatia, who I assume is Chakko Bhatia, also from the weekly on this.
Chucky, the older brother was Chakko.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I think just it's so many like weekly connections here today.
how much longer do we have? Because we have
I think we have about 9
pretty-
minutes.
9 minutes. Okay. Do you guys want to do a very sort of Pandora's box type question that someone's been patiently waiting to ask for both of you?
I'm game.
Sure,
Totally
whatever
game.
works.
All right. So they're talking about this is a big one, the distribution and ethics of distribution because of the Frances Haugen testimony
Yeah.
about the distribution landscape with large tech platforms like Facebook or Google bias the visibility of contents towards hateful and inflammatory material as a way of attracting web traffic for advertising. So how do we produce content and products in an ethical manner that is resistant to this pressure? That's sort
Yeah.
of the big, question
Yeah.
of all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the media companies themselves don't have such a big problem because they have their editorial standards and the ethical standards that they have to adhere to and follow, and that's what underpins their trust. The Economist is definitely like this. The New York Times, all these publications have their editorial boards. They have their kind of trust that they have to follow certain rules that the journalists have. I think what Frances Haugen and others are pointing out is more about the platforms. And I think the platforms have realized that almost their number one job is content moderation. The algorithms can really spin up all kinds of content and drive traffic to certain pieces of content. And what I think all the social research is showing increasingly is that if you play on people's emotions, either it's confirmation bias, it's, I have a particular pejorative view of something, or it's a tribal view of something, I'm going to definitely like, share, retweet, get angry about something, get worked up on something. So the social engineering or the social dynamics on all these platforms can be quite a force. It can be quite a negative force, and it needs to be managed. And so as much as Facebook and others don't want to moderate content, they just have to, because there can be hateful content, there can be content. So I think there's a big ethical consideration in the design of products increasingly, that does your product create a negative social effect, is something that I think all people who work in the product management function do need to think about. And I know that a lot of people I talk to who work in my function in the product management function now really think about these things, because you never want to create something that has a negative social consequence on the world. I don't know, Govind, I'm sure you have a view of all of this.
Oh, no, I don't. That was perfectly answered by you. And I'm just going to segue into, I did have a question for you about a Clubhouse and the sort of thing that then Twitter tried to jump onto the bandwagon. Yeah. I don't know what Twitter calls theirs. Basu, have you seen these?
Spaces?
Yeah,
Twitter
Spaces, I think Twitter
Yeah.
Spaces, right?
Yeah.
Spaces.
Yeah.
Do you think this is just a flash in the pan, or you think this has legs? Because I just don't see. I think the Economist banned them, or it was the FT.
Yeah, I mean, I joined Clubhouse. I thought it was really cool to be able to basically kind of join someone's chat or conference call or audio way of interacting with people. I think I have all of 35 followers on the app on Clubhouse. But yeah, I think, as a lot of people are now pointing out, that once Twitter launched Spaces, if all the conversations on text are happening on Twitter and people are sharing news and discussing things there, and then Twitter adds its own version of that thing, then they control a lot of distribution. Whereas you have, a new app trying to establish a new audience is obviously harder. So, there's been so much of this in the kind of social media industry of people ripping off each other's features and trying to, have the power of distribution be on that platform and then try to cross promote to different products, whether that product stays first as a feature in a single app, over time becomes its own app. Yeah, it's really interesting how quickly these things come and go now.
Yeah. So before we end, can I ask both of you a quick question? I think we talked about it a little bit, but so this is part of the old boys talks. And we've talked about a little bit about the stuff that we did in school that had a big impact on us. So I wanted to ask you guys, like, just quickly, top of mind, what experiences, friends, teachers, or classes from school that still sort of linger with you after all these years, as a way to sort of put a little button on the whole thing for both of you?
Yeah, Govind, want to go first?
Okay. As the kind of chief nostalgia merchant at the DSOBS, I think what I found really incredible about the school is just how, regardless of it was that I think it's a motif that we see in some of our favorite kind of coming of age films, whether it's The Goonies or others, where there's like an older brother figure, and he spends a fair amount of time ragging his younger brother, making fun of him, and generally putting him through hell. But the second there was any sort of external threat, the older brother would just kind of step up and say, listen, you need to step off. He's my younger brother. I can do what I like, but you can't. And the amazing thing about Doon is that even though I was more on the sort of academic side of things, which was the kind of student that didn't go down too well, I managed to find a middle ground with a lot of people at school who we all stuck together. There's a fraternal code that was, very self-righteous and seemingly honorable, which still pulls us through today. And it's an incredible bond, incredible code that I'm now trying to inculcate in my son. Whether it's just in terms of how to stick together through thick and thin. So I think that's my takeaway.
Yeah, I think we're almost out of time, but you only get to where you get to in life by standing on other people's shoulders and with other people's help. And I just think, like, obviously friends and family, but I think Doon's a really special place. I see Shomi Das, I think on the call. I don't know if it's the Shomi Das, but like I remember his days as headmaster.
Oh my God.
I remember so many people that I would just like to name. Piyush Malviya. I was on my first midterm kind of trek. I felt sick and he took care of me and took me to a doctor. S.J. David, who was my housemaster, an amazing English teacher. I'm really sad, that I couldn't meet him again after school. There was Shashank Veera, who helped me put the weekly together week after week, sitting in his study, in his office, giving me cups of tea in his house near Oberoi House. Philip Burrett, who taught us how to run cross country and play football. Gurcharan Das, from whom I learned so much music. I see Sarabjit Walia, Mr. Walia's son. He was my form tutor and taught me so much. BKS, who was like the economics teacher, and I decided to study economics literally because of his class. And then Devendra Singh, like DVS, was such an amazing physics teacher. I was so bad at science, but I decided to take physics because he was the teacher and did really well at it. And I also recently heard that C.K. Dixit passed away. And I know so many of the people on the WhatsApp channel for our 96 batch just singing his praises. I never went to Foothouse. I went directly to Jaipur House and D-Form. But I can just, there's so many of these stories and so many people that had an influence on you. It's a wonderful place. And there's all these amazing connections. I know we're out of time.
Basu, do you want to wrap up?
I was going to say, I think for me, there'll be a DOSCO talk for another day.
I just remembered something amazing about David. There is a person on this chat who shall remain nameless who actually gave me a favor to write one of his English essays. And when I went into David's class, he said to me, Govind, I know you wrote that essay. So I was like, my signature stands through, which was pretty good.
So I think, Tarun, you were going to wrap it up for us, right? You and Samir?
Right. Thanks, Basu. Well, gentlemen, it's been a fantastic hour. I mean, great conversations, lovely memories. Thank you for sharing your personal experiences. And thank you for such an engaging topic. Govind and Basu, thanks for coming up with it. Deep, thank you for your inputs and your perspectives and views on what is really very important and a subject that is something that we're going to have to discuss over and over again. Because frankly speaking, your answers may change every year. So thank you for that. Gentlemen, thanks again. This video will be up on the DSOBS YouTube channel in case you'd like to see yourselves again or like to pass it on to friends and family. Thanks again for joining us today. On behalf of Sam and myself and the entire EC of the DSOBS, thank you very, very much. And see you all perhaps attending another talk.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Deep. Thanks, Basu. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night. Goodbye.